Chapter 2. April. April moved to the music, but her heart was not in dancing tonight. Ever since the night Jefferson had proposed to Lucia, April had been hoping Carter Young would call her. He'd asked for her number, but so far, no call. She wasn't sure what to make of that. He'd seemed interested, and she knew that she was pretty enough that men usually at least made the call. Whether or not it turned into more than one date depended on how they connected once they went out. But she wasn't used to waiting for a call. "Where is your mind tonight?" Javier asked her as he tapped lightly on her forehead. Javier was probably her closest friend besides her roommate Lucia. As Lucia was much more of a homebody, he was the one she went clubbing with the most often, and he knew most of her expressions. Enough to know when she wasn't herself, anyway. April shook her head and let a soft sigh escape her lips. "It's nothing. I just finally met a single player on the Tornado team the other night, and he asked for my number, but he hasn't called." Javier lifted an eyebrow as he moved his head with the beat of the blaring music. Unlike a lot of guys on the dance floor, Javier had rhythm, and the sometimes annoying habit of never remaining still when music played. "Which one?" "Carter Young." "The playboy?" The disdain was as evident in Javier's voice as it was in the "are you kidding me" expression he gave her. Javier had asked April out once, and they'd tried dating, only to quickly realize they were definitely better friends than anything more. Though he was only a few months older than she was, he often acted like an older brother, at least when it came to the men she dated. April shrugged. Playboys can be tamed. She knew of Carter's reputation, but just because he was never seen with the same woman more than once didn't mean he would never see a woman more than once. Maybe he was just picky and hadn't found the right one yet. Or maybe he was like April and not looking for anything long-term. Actually, she wasn't sure she wasn't looking for anything long-term, but she certainly hadn't been able to envision a future with any of the men she'd dated recently. Javier shook his head at her. "You know better than that. Playboys are only ever after one thing." "Until they find the right woman." April smiled up at him and flicked her fiery hair over her shoulder. She knew he was right. Not only was Javier a bit of a serial dater himself, but she'd dated a few guys like that in the past, and it never ended well. But this was Carter Young. "You know they rarely find the right woman," he said, using his fingers to make air quotes around the word right. "You should know," she teased back at him. "Besides, who said I wanted something serious? This is Carter Young we're talking about. Even a few dates with him would get me noticed. Maybe it would even help my business." Javier rolled his dark eyes and ran his hand through his hair. "Yeah, your business. I'm sure that's what you're thinking about when you look at Carter Young." "I'm always thinking about work," April said. "When you own your own business, there's not really a time you're not thinking about how to make it better, get more clients, etc." She counted the reasons on her fingers. "Besides, helping Jefferson Davis out certainly boosted my business. Adding Carter to the mix would probably do the same." "Yeah, except you have no place to grow where you're at anyway. Could you even take more clients?" April exhaled deeply. "A few, but I'm hoping to find my own office space to lease soon." She was well aware of how limited she was in her current space. But if she could find her own office space, she could expand. Maybe hire a few other massage therapists to help with the load, and hopefully bring in new clients. "Now that would be aces." Javier said. "I better be the first person you call when you get a bigger place." Of course. April couldn't believe he even thought he had to ask. Javier had been one of her first clients, and he'd become one of her regulars before they became friends. A computer tech at one of the largest companies in the city, he often spent hours hunched over a computer screen, and she would have to spend almost as many hours working out the knots in his shoulders. "Hey, you want to dance?" April turned to the deep voice behind her. The man was handsome, with dark hair and hazel green eyes that reminded her of leaves as they began to change color in the fall. Even his smile seemed warm and inviting, but April just wasn't in the mood to try and strike up a conversation with a total stranger. "I'd love to, but I'm dancing with my friend." She turned back to point at Javier, but he had ditched her to dance with the blonde he'd been eyeing half the night. When he caught her glaring at him, he flashed a smile and a look that said, "Go on, he seems like a catch." With a sigh, she turned back to the man. She supposed it wouldn't be that big of a deal to dance with him. After all, she didn't have to take him home or go home with him. "I guess my friend left me." He flashed a wink before pulling her close to his very solid chest. "I guess it's a good thing I came over then." April pasted a small smile on her face, but she couldn't force herself to nod in agreement. Though he was exactly the type of guy she would normally hit on, she just didn't have it in her tonight. Not only was the smell of alcohol heavy on the man's breath, but her thoughts were still circling around Carter and why he hadn't called yet. "You come here often?" the man whispered in her ear. It was not the lamest pickup line she'd ever heard, but it wasn't the best one either. "Not really." She pulled back slightly to give herself some breathing room. The guy, she should probably ask him his name, but didn't for fear he would take it as interest, was a little too close for comfort at the moment. In actuality, she came to this club often, more often than she probably should, but she felt no need to tell him that. "I'm pretty sure I've seen you here before," he said over the music. His hands tightened their grip on her back. "You're definitely too pretty to miss." "Thanks." April glanced around for Javier. She was going to let him have it for leaving her alone with this guy. Though he was still dancing with the blonde, his eyes widened when he registered her distress signal. It was a sign they had worked out long ago. If either of them felt they needed a rescue, they would tap the back of their head 3 times, and the other would come to their aid. It was a ridiculous-looking gesture, but they'd both agreed it needed to be big enough to be seen across a room. April hated to draw him away from the woman he'd been waiting to talk to all night, but the man with his arms around her was beginning to raise the hairs on the back of her neck, and that was never a good sign. Relief flooded her body as she watched Javier point her direction and whisper something to the blonde. The girl glanced over quickly and nodded before disappearing into the crowd, leaving Javier to make his way over to April. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, tapping April's shoulder as if needing to get her attention. "But I just got a call from home. We have to go." "Is everything okay?" April asked, playing along. Though they'd rehearsed this before, it felt fake and unnatural as her eyes widened. "I'm not sure." "Well, then how about you go home, and I'll take her home later." The guy spun April in an effort to block Javier. "Sorry, no can do. She's needed too." Grabbing April's hand, Javier continued April's spin, out of the man's arms and into his own. April could have kissed him at that moment, even though they'd tried that when they dated, and it had been a disaster. She flashed an apologetic look at her dance partner. I'm sorry, I really do have to go. Maybe I'll see you around again. The guy held her gaze. His indecisiveness as to whether he should agree or not. Finally, he let go and stepped back. Yeah, maybe you will, he said, before shaking his head and wandering away from them. Thank you, April whispered as she clutched Javier's arm. You're welcome, but you owe me. He threw his arm over her shoulder as they headed toward the exit. April suppressed a shudder as she glanced to where the guy had gone. I will happily owe you. He didn't seem that bad. And he hadn't, at least not at first. But April still couldn't get the ghost of his hands off her skin. Something about him didn't sit right with her, and she was glad that her mind had been too focused on Carter to flirt with this guy. She had a feeling she would have regretted it if she had.